no, we're not having this argument. The customer feedback was very clear. This is what we need to build to compete. And if we're not willing to build that, then why are we here?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Circuit. I am Ben Bajarin.
Greetings, programs. I'm Jay Goldberg.
Well, we are joined by a wonderful guest. We are joined by Michelle Johnston. We are here at Intel Vision, and we have her as a wonderful guest. So why don't you just, hello, this is what I do. You're already famous, everybody knows, but there we go.
Well, first off, thank you for having me. Michelle Johnston, CEO of Intel Products, and thanks for joining us at Vision.
Yes, happy to be here. So one of the things I appreciate greatly and became very clear about your leadership style, I think the first earnings call was your candidness. I think also your ability to see and recognize some challenges of Intel in the past, and also taking a very customer-forward sort of style of just listening and embracing, taking that harsh feedback, not being afraid of that harsh feedback. And I've done this long enough to have gone through lots of Intel product leaders, and I remember when there was a lot of frustration of customers that Intel just sort of, dictated to us what should happen, and it feels like that's changed. So maybe just start off for those who aren't familiar and just kind of give this is how I see things, this is my leadership style, and why you think that's important for this next stage of Intel.
Okay, it's a great question, and I do know that I'm probably a bit different than others, but maybe coming from a strong sales background. And I think I would remind everybody, I was in sales as we were just starting to see kind of the shift in the data center roadmap where competitors were becoming more and more capable, and we were starting to lose market segment share. And I remember sitting in conversations with customers where we would have them being very thoughtful and very methodical about what was working and what wasn't working. And we just continued to tell them why our roadmap was the best thing over and over. And I got really, really frustrated because at some point, people stop talking to you because why tell you if you're not going to listen? And so I created this term within sales of you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Use your ears a whole lot more. Start listening. Customer feedback's a gift. Anyone in this industry can be disrupted. We're currently being disrupted. And so my goal is to listen to customers each and every day. Feedback, positive or negative, is absolutely a gift because somebody took the time to give it to you. And the power is, what do you do with it? How do you take it to heart? How do you pivot? How are you flexible enough to move dynamically to the market needs while still building things in mass? Because obviously at Intel, we do things on a very large scale. And I really started that when I moved from sales to the client group of just saying, listen, stop telling me why you're so great. When the customers tell us we're great, that's when we're great, right? And just continue to listen, continue to pivot. And Ben, as you know, when I came to CCG, our roadmap was not great. So having a high say-do ratio, but there's nothing more powerful to a customer than feeling like they're heard, seeing somebody make a change, and feeling like they're trusted and valued. And if you bring that to the table every day, people will give you a chance.
So a big topic among outsiders around looking at Intel and the future of Intel is this question of culture, right? And I think you've touched on it. How do you think about the culture of Intel right now in your organization? What needs to change? How are you going to go about changing it?
Well, culture is the key, and it is very, very difficult to change in a group and an organization as large as we have. I think it really starts, I'm going to call it the epicenter, like that first level manager that is working with the team who has to make the actual changes to the roadmap or to the way we do engineering or the tools that we use, and explaining to them why you have to make that. And it is also convincing, which can be a challenge for me at times because I don't come from a technical background, the brightest people on the planet and tell them, I know you're really smart, but I actually want you to turn off your brain right now and I want you to listen. And I want you to understand the problem that a customer is trying to solve. And just because you think it's the best idea doesn't actually mean it is the best idea. And so the way we did that in CCG is I made all of my engineers start going to customers on a very regular basis. And I moved our product updates from marketing delivering those to product planning and engineering delivering those. Because when they walk in and they're so proud of this complex and complicated roadmap that they've created, and the customer says, too complicated, doesn't meet my needs, doesn't hit my price point, doesn't hit my performance or power or whatever it might be, it's very hard to argue with the person who's going to buy your product. So it starts with just bringing in the customer voice every day. It also means stopping meetings in the middle and saying, no, we're not having this argument. The customer feedback was very clear. This is what we need to build to compete. And if we're not willing to build that, then why are we here? So you just have to constantly be doing that. And you have to obviously show that from the top, but at the end of the day, you have to get, I always say, you got to get a small enough contingent on the bus with you to move it along. And we were able to do it in a small group, CCG. Now, my bigger challenge now is, how do you get 40,000 product people to all think customer first? To turn off that, I'm going to call it that smart gene that they have, and just listen and be willing to innovate and take input and to pivot from what they might have thought was perfect.
So I think part of the challenge though is you're making those changes, but you're on I think you used a bus metaphor,
Yeah.
but the bus is on a train and the train itself is changing because
Yeah.
Intel is going through a lot of change.
Everywhere, yes.
One of the things I've always been curious about is with now the sort of setup of Foundry as a separate organization, that relationship, which used to be sort of very, very tight, is now arm's length. How do you adapt to that? And part of the reason I ask, I'll give you my context, is I used to compete against the data center group.
Okay.
And we would have a good product. We would take it to one of the hyperscalers, and we'd say, hey, look, here's our roadmap. We're going to have this product with these specs, and it's going to be X% better than what Intel's going to have at that time. And then feedback would get back to Intel, to you, and all of a sudden there'd be a sort of a hot job, a rush would be put in, and suddenly the customer would have samples before we could get them samples. That's gonna be much harder to do with Foundry being separate. Now, how do you adapt to that?
Yeah, I actually don't think it's much harder to do with Foundry being separate. I think even with Foundry and Product Co being separate, there is a fundamental understanding that there is a layer of the foundation that's the same. And there is a capability set for product to be successful and for Foundry to be successful as customer zero that has to remain. Really, all I see changing there is today that would be a phone call from me to you saying, hey, I need you to do this. And now we'll have more formalities in how that happens. But at the end of the day, the magic, and I do mean magic, really happens when you have a great process technology and a great design product. And those two things can come together and you can continually optimize one for the other. That's where our customers actually get really, really excited. And as you mentioned, that's when historically we can make up for a shortcoming in any one area by that relationship. To me, that should never change. It might look different from the outside, but the way it works inside might have more formalities, but 100% can't change at the root of there is a mutual success between the two companies.
Okay. Could you maybe let's dive a little bit deeper
Please.
into Foundry. You talked about this on the earnings call, but I think a big topic of interest is your degrees of freedom to choose the Foundry that is best for your product. Can you just talk about how you think through that? How are you going to sort of?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it is about delivering the best product SKU for the customer. And I use that word very importantly because when I think about a family of products, some can be built at TSMC and some can be built inside. And I really want to optimize the actual product SKU to the node where it is on the yield and performance ramp. And so sometimes I might choose TSMC because maybe for their process, maybe they're at the absolute peak of their performance yield curve, and I'm building a product that I want a lot of in a very short amount of time because my market window to really enjoy the margin of that product is quite short. So you landed there. Whereas my mass products, I'd want to land on an Intel Foundry because I want to help them get through that performance and yield curve, and I have, obviously a pretty distinct cost advantage when it comes to that. So to me, it's more about optimizing across a product line to deliver exactly what the customer needs when they need it in volume and scale. And so my team and I have a lot of rigorous debates about where product should be built. And you might imagine there's always a lot of pressure of, hey, you should build it inside. But I also have a lot of debates with my Foundry partners to say, when I don't choose to build it inside, that's actually when we really need to have a much deeper conversation of why didn't I choose it? What can we learn from that? And that is a competitive advantage to learn from that. I mean, I'll be the first to admit TSMC is a fabulous partner. CC has customer service down. He knows exactly what he's doing. And there's a reason they've been able to really do a good job over the last decade. That is the same customer service bent and culture that our Foundry needs. So if I don't first act like a customer to them and give them that really tough feedback, they're not going to get better. I mean, before we were kind of beholden to Foundry. Now I say, hey, we're going to pick the best process to deliver the best product for our customer. But my job is also to make Foundry the most customer-oriented, customer-centric Foundry out there. That's a very high bar. But I view that as much my job as it is the Foundry's job.
I actually think that's a pretty crucial point that probably got missed and not appreciated with you guys making a good portion of Lunar and others at TSMC, is that you have the now TSMC experience. Like you have the
100%.
We went through it. We know what our competitors are going through in terms of like the services they get. And if Foundry isn't stopping up to that, like you said, you can say like, look guys, this has got to get better because we worked with the king and the king was better than you. And so, I actually think that's hugely valuable, right, for Foundry. And I do think the autonomy that you have is comforting. I actually think a lot of people wanted to see that. I think TSMC, does do some tiles, better than others, some process better than others. And so I think knowing they have that autonomy would strengthen the view or the confidence in Intel products. So I think that's good.
I think for our customers, that's 100% true.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about x86, but more about Intel architecture.
Okay.
It seems like x86 is in need of some, what do you want to say, some oomph, some
boost,
some reinvigoration.
Okay.
So there's that part, but then there's another part we have said several times in the circuit, and so since you're here, I'm gonna lob it out for the first time.
Okay.
I would love to see the return of Intel architecture, and what I mean by that is, do you remember back in the days we would say IA?
Yep.
IA was always a statement that said this is architecturally superior to other things. So I know it sounds like we're going backwards, but I feel like a day has come where something like that is useful again, because now you need to be saying we're actually differentiating architecture again, because I think that had been lost and that's critical. So maybe just two things, x86 and then how do we reinvigorate and reinvent Intel architecture in this new age?
You know what's really interesting that I learned when I was covering for Pat? I obviously started to talk to customers I wouldn't have talked to on a pretty regular basis. And every single customer was building some custom ARM thing. And they all would say to me, Michelle, there is a real value in x86. There's real value in that ecosystem. What you guys missed, again, back to that listening and customer point, is it wasn't perfectly packaged for me. It wasn't that I was against x86 as an architecture. I was against the fact that you wouldn't build me something that allowed me to differentiate myself.
Right.
And so when we did this x86 consortium, all of a sudden, people were like, wait, what? You're willing to have a conversation about using your chiplet, maybe my I/O or my, special sauce, and you'll package that all on one chip and give it to me? Well, that's a whole different conversation. And I do think that when you think about particularly high performance compute, x86 is very, very well suited for that. And imagine what x86 can be if all of those customers are giving us input for how to make it better. And so for me, I look at it as we can reinvigorate x86 because it isn't like they left x86. We left them. We didn't give them the optionality to deliver what they needed for their customers. They all like it. They all love the ecosystem around it. Like, I think one thing that we all forget a lot is how powerful that software ecosystem is. And so I look at it as, I think we have a crown jewel. We just haven't necessarily figured out the right way to use it. And so can we be flexible enough, customizable enough, and open enough to actually change what x86 architecture looks like? What is it today? What does it need to include in the future? How can we pivot and grow so that we can still deliver to the masses, but also customize for the few?
Right.
To me, that's the way we get back there. Because if when you think about IA, you often thought about Intel architecture, but what was so powerful was it was actually everybody's
Yes,
architecture.
right.
And everybody was piling in, making it better and better because it was what everybody used. And so
Right.
I look at it and say, hey, we just need to bring everybody back to the table. We need to be great listeners. We need to be pivoting. We need to be iterating really, really quickly. And I think if we can get there, we can be quite disruptive. And I'm quite excited about it.
Yeah, agreed. So when you think about, and one theme, I don't know if this was intentional at Vision, but just the broad taxonomy that was continually used, I heard the word chiplets a lot.
Yeah.
And I say that because I don't think too many people have fully appreciated that we're really fully moving from monolithic to disaggregated design. Okay, so that in itself is disruptive. So like Intel talks, you've talked about like, hey, how are we going to be disruptive? Well, I feel like embracing chiplets, leading in chiplets, being aggressive in design, architecturally with chiplet is one of those things where you guys have a strong advantage. And so maybe just talk about that, because the questions leading up to like, how are you going to differentiate, what advantage do you have to compete? I would say chiplets is part of that. Maybe it's more, but
yeah, I think chiplets is an important part of that. When you think about what it would have meant to make a custom monolithic die, that's like a whole new design every time.
Yeah.
If you just think about chiplets like Legos, and I gave you 7 Legos and I gave you 7 Legos, you'd build something very different. But you may have used all the same pieces. It's just the way you put it together. So if you combine the fact that I could take a customer's chiplets, my advanced packaging capabilities, and my manufacturing capabilities, and put them together, it's a distinct change and shift. And we use that language because, I said today I want to bring customers' visions and dreams to reality. Part of that is they know what they want. I want them to see Intel as an option. And I don't think that they ever really thought it was an option. It was kind of like, you buy what's on the roadmap. So imagine if I say to them now, like, much like I can manufacture something for you and you have to have a lot of IPs available for them to bring a product to your process. What if I said, hey, I got a lot of IPs in chiplet form. How do you want to mix or match that on a substrate to build and deliver for your customers? It's a very different conversation.
Right.
And it actually allows your customers to start dreaming.
Right.
And when they're dreaming, then all of a sudden you become part of the conversation, you get a seat at the table, and it becomes this back and forth iteration that is much easier said than done.
Sure.
But that's really our idea, which is we need to be part of the solution. And if that's not the full, custom, standard Xeon that we have on our roadmap for you, okay, then what is it? What does that look like? How can I build that for you? And if you think about not only our design capabilities, our packaging, and then our manufacturing, it's a very interesting value proposition to be able to bring to customers where they've had to do all that themselves. And I'm certainly not suggesting that anyone would stop doing that themselves.
Sure.
They're still going to keep building their own thing. I just hope they want to build their own thing with me inside.
Yeah. And I think there's some really interesting parts of this because one, the chiplet era, I think, brings us back to a fascinating era of design again, because you do have so many options, right?
Yes.
In monolithic, it was like, well, how many CPU cores? Let's maybe a GPU. Like your options are limited, but I feel like this kind of new design era is going to be very interesting. I also think it's going to be highly competitive, which again comes back to how you guys think about Intel architecture as segments of the market and where your point of view, like where you believe that market's going. But it's going to enable design again. And I think that's fascinating. And I also think that's really interesting from a Foundry standpoint, because you guys could arguably be a leader in chiplet Foundry. Not that TSMC doesn't do this, but the vast majority of their chips are monolithic, not chiplet, and lead in that, both in terms of what you're pushing Foundry to do, right, to succeed, and what Foundry can do. So I think this is a very interesting time, right, to again be embracing new parts of the market that weren't there before that actually suit Intel's strengths.
Agreed. I'm very excited. It'll be very interesting to see what comes of this. But I think part of it is just opening the aperture for the conversation, which I think a lot of customers didn't think they could have before. And so, we all think about, and we've all talked about all week, AI. Everybody's AI implementation and deployment will be very different. If you're just thinking about, am I using copper or silicon photonics, everybody has their own ideas for what's right, what makes sense. So imagine if your secret sauce could all be packaged in one way. But it requires humility, really great listening skills, and the actual willingness to give up on the exact thing you thought you were doing and really have more of an ecosystem architecture approach of I'm constantly learning and pivoting and willing to change my core architecture to meet the needs of customers versus what I am
Right.
comfortable building. So
Right.
it is definitely a culture shift to your original question.
So then, what do you think Intel needs to do in AI to become part of the conversation again?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think in AI PC we are part of the conversation, but let's set that aside. Let's just talk about accelerators, XPUs, and x86. We just need to build something first. I mean, we've got Gaudi. I think it's interesting. Obviously, you see it this week. We've done a very, very good deployment with IBM that I'm excited about. But we need to iterate and have a product for people to use every year. I mean, the feedback I get from customers is, yeah, great. I really like the idea of Jaguar Shores, but that's 2 years. And in 2 years,
Yeah.
AI is like a whole different world. So we've got to figure out, how do we get a seat at the table? How do we continue to iterate, build products, even if they're not perfect? Like I keep telling my engineering team, even if it's not the perfect spec, build it. And I use this example. So when we built our first graphics card, codename Alchemist, it was a disaster out the gate. I mean, I don't think I've ever had so many customer calls about how bad the software was, et cetera. But over 18 months, we learned a lot in what it actually meant to work with an ISV ecosystem and deliver a good product. And we got to Battlemage, and it was a very competitive product that like sold out right away. I kind of equate that same parallel to AI. You just have to get in the game. You've got to be learning. You got to understand what the software stack is, the ISVs, what's happening at the system level. And if you don't have that conversation at the table, there's no way in 2 years you're building the best product, because you're not even part of like, what are the pain points today? And so I'm like, what can you build in 26? What can you build in 27? What can you build in 28? And that's how we get back to the table. It is very, very difficult. Now, here's the good news, at least Michelle's view of it. Xeon does work for inference today, and we are learning there. It is not the be-all, end-all, but it is at least half a seat at the table. We know that there's going to be a massive inference build-out. You heard that from one of our largest competitors, and I do think that anyone in this industry can be disrupted. And therefore, I think the way we come into this market can't be, hey, just don't worry about it. In 2 years, we're going to come in with the best product that's better than anybody else in the marketplace and think that everybody's going to line up and buy our product.
Right.
That's not the way it's going to work.
Right.
We're going to have to come in seams, work with different sets of customers, different price points, different features, and we're going to have to be humble and agile and willing to learn. I have been inundated, as you can imagine, with feedback, Jay, over the last 4 months. But it's actually very exciting to me because everybody wants choice, right? And so we can be part of giving customers choice, having a seat at the table, helping us create. And so to me, these are problems that Intel absolutely can solve. We have brilliant engineers at Intel. We just need to unleash them to solve our customers' problems. And I think you heard Lip-Bu talk a little bit about that this week. I think sometimes they're so mired in bureaucracy and process that they haven't just been, let go. So he talks about like making these small teams, just take a small team, go build, just tell me, go build something.
Yep.
This team, go build something. This team, go build that. Hey, 2 out of 3 can be complete flops, but if 1 is good, that's all we needed.
Yep.
I think it's a mindset shift. It's a massive mindset shift. And it's a shift that the CPU is not the epicenter of everything. And so, I tell people all the time, listen, you can look at the CPU TAM, and yes, cores are growing in data center, but the units aren't growing. But look at this XPU TAM, look at this ASIC TAM, look at this accelerator TAM.
Yep.
We want to participate in this. Everybody wants to. There's not anybody at Intel who says, yeah, that's not an interesting market. But it's getting people away from what's really comfortable to build and what we know, and to be risk takers and to be willing to fail and pivot and learn.
Yeah.
And so we have to make it safe for them to do that. So I'm very excited about some of the concepts that Lip-Bu talked about.
Yeah. It's actually interesting. The partner that you brought up on stage from the military made this point that he said, in the military, it's better to make the wrong decision quickly than the right decision too late. And I was like, you know what? That implies to some of these things that Intel's got to do. Because you're right. You just need to be in these conversations. Because the reality is, we talk about this all the time on this podcast, we have no idea what workloads are going to look like in 3 years. We don't know where they're going to run.
Yep.
And you got to make some bets. And you could be wrong. You could be right. And it could work out wonderfully. But as long as you're nimble, and that small team thing, I think that helps. I think that's refreshing to know that Intel's not stuck in one
Yeah.
of mindset, because as you well know, right, there was always the like, it's the CPU.
I know.
We're a CPU company, and it's hard to get out of that, right, in this growth era. So, maybe just quickly, since you mentioned Lip-Bu's approach,
Yeah.
you got a new guy, 14 days in the helm. Maybe just what have you thought? Like, how has he come in? And he obviously wants to change a lot to culture, but just quick take on the new CEO.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I know Lip-Bu from sitting on our board, so obviously I have a good relationship with him there. I think what I'm most excited is, I mean, he's been at the forefront of all of these startups, all this M&A activity happening in the marketplace. So he's got, I think, a very interesting kind of outside-in viewpoint that I think we can all learn from. He obviously has a long, storied history, both at Cadence, but also a lot of deep relationships with our customers and a very customer-centric approach. And anyone who knows me, that's like, yes, finally. I think we just have to remember to give him time, right? Like, he has a lot of ideas coming in. We need to be good listeners. We can't be defensive. And we just need to allow him the time to, figure out how he's going to put his positive mark on Intel. But there's 100,000 employees that are quite excited to have a permanent CEO, and are excited to learn from him. And I think we also have to help teach him not the Intel way, because that would be a negative, but also, feel comfortable enough to have, I think, a vigorous debate, because he has a very different view. We're going to have different views. And what I've actually found in the first 14 days is they're actually not that different. We might say them differently, but they're actually the same way. But I think it'll be really great for him to challenge a lot of our approaches, a lot of our cultural norms, as well as like getting us out of meetings and like just unleashing our engineers to innovate, I think will be very, very powerful. So I think everybody's quite excited. Happy to have him here.
Yes, very good. Well, Michelle, thank you for joining us. We definitely talk about Intel a lot on this podcast, sometimes in, glowing things, sometimes challengingly, but I do think a lot's changed in the last 2 years. I mean, I do think people believe, right, that Intel has stopped drinking the Kool-Aid, as you recall, like back in the day, it was always like, dude, they're drinking the Kool-Aid, like this is insane. I feel like that's changed, and I do feel like it seems like a positive vibe shift, especially from customers. I think mostly the OEMs we talk to and those in the market feel that. So I hope that there's continued momentum into what is hopefully one of the most epic turnarounds in
we hope we're all
history.
here for that epic ride. And, at the end of the day, we're as good as what we do for our customers. And so hearing that feedback is good, but we still have a long ways to go. And we need to remain grounded and customer-oriented and people-oriented. I think that's also really important of, bringing our employees along on this culture journey. It's a change. It's just shift. They're tired and it can be scary sometimes, but I think when you see those results come to fruition and you see your customers excited about the work that you're doing, and that, you're listening and you're seeing that result in sales or, innovative design wins, that makes everybody at Intel very excited. So thank you for having me.
Yes, we really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Anytime.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We will talk to you next time.
Tell your friends. Thank you.